Section 3 of My Musical Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Warren Bergman. My Musical Life by Walter Damrosch. Chapter 3. Founding of the Symphony and Oratorio Societies of New York. In 1873, Anton Rubinstein, greatest of Russian pianists, accompanied by the violinist Wieniawski, came to America by invitation of Steinway and Sons. He dined at our house and expressed wonder that my father had not yet been able to achieve a position in New York commensurate with his reputation and capacity. My father explained to him how difficult the situation was, and that the entire orchestral field was monopolized by Theodore Thomas. He told Rubinstein that when he had first arrived in New York, he had met Thomas at the music store of Edward Schubert in Union Square, and that after the introduction, Thomas had said to him, "I hear, Dr. Damrosch, that you are a very fine musician, but I want to tell you one thing. Whoever crosses my path, I crush." Thomas at that time really believed that America was not large enough to contain more than one orchestra, but he lived long enough to see my father surpass him at the head of a symphony orchestra. As founder of the first great music festival in New York and, above all, of opera in German at the Metropolitan. In 1881, the first symphony orchestra on a permanent basis had been founded in Boston by Major Higginson. And before Thomas's death, there were half a dozen great subsidized orchestras actively operating in the United States, a number which has since then increased to 12. Rubinstein said to my father, "Why don't you begin by founding an oratorio society, and that will lead to other things?" My father consulted a few devoted friends, and the Oratorio Society of New York was accordingly founded in 1873, and began rehearsals in the Trinity Chapel with a chorus of about 18 singers, my mother's glorious voice leading the sopranos, and my very humble and little self among the altos. The first performance took place in the warerooms of the Cannabi Piano Company the following winter, at which time the chorus had increased to 60 singers. The program was a remarkable one for that period, containing a cappella chorus and accompanied choruses by Bach, Mozart, Handel, Palestrina, and Mendelssohn. From this small beginning the society developed until it became the foremost representative of choral music in New York, performing with a chorus of 350 voices under my father's direction the older oratorios of Handel, Haydn, and Mendelssohn, and such novelties as the first part of Christus by Liszt, the Berlioz Requiem and Damnation of Faust, the Brahms Requiem, Cohen's Saint Ursula, the choral finale from the first act of Parsifal, and the third act of Meistersinger. Indirectly but logically, the founding of the Oratorio Society led to the founding of the Symphony Society of New York in 1877, which at last gave my father an orchestra with which he could demonstrate his abilities as a symphonic conductor. The differences between him and Thomas were very marked. Thomas, who had educated himself entirely in America, had always striven for great cleanliness of execution, a metronomical accuracy and rigidity of tempo, and a strict and literal, and therefore rather mechanical, observance of the signs put down by the composers. America owed him a great debt of gratitude for the high quality of his programs. My father had been educated in a more modern school of interpretation, and his readings were emotionally more intense. He was the first conductor in this country to make those fine and delicate gradations in tempo according to the inner demands of the music, gradations which are too subtle to be indicated by the composer's signs, as that would lead to exaggerations, but which are now generally considered as necessary in order to bring out the melos of a work. Both conductors had their violent partisans, and as they were at that time literally the only orchestral conductors in America, feeling ran very high. My father was the last comer, and Thomas was well fortified in the field, with a group of wealthy men to support him. The first years for my father were very hard, and a portion of the New York papers assailed him bitterly, continuously, and with vindictive enmity. Again and again dreams of murder would fill my boyish heart when I would read one of these attacks in the morning paper. It was hard work to keep the two societies going and to enable them to meet the bills for hall rent, soloists, and orchestra. There was as yet but a small public for the higher forms of music, and again it looked as if further efforts would have to be abandoned. But my father persevered and struggled on, making a living for his family by teaching violin, composition, and singing, and occasionally getting a fee of $100 in gold as violin soloist or in a chamber music concert, officiating as musical director in a church, and as conductor of the German male choral society, the Orion. The first production of Symphony No. 1 in C minor by Brahms became the subject of intense rivalry between the two conductors. Brahms had waited until his 40th year before writing a symphony, and the work was eagerly awaited in New York, as the reports from Germany proved that it had made a sensation. My father went to see old Gustav Schirmer at his store on Broadway and asked him whether the orchestral score of this work had yet arrived. Schirmer told him that it had, but that he was in honor bound to give it to Theodore Thomas as he had promised it to him. My father was very much chagrined to think that this prize should thus have escaped him, and he spoke of this very regretfully to a pupil of his in composition, Mrs. James Nielsen, member of an aristocratic old family in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and a woman of great beauty and distinction. Mrs. Nielsen said nothing to my father, but quietly went down to Schirmer's and inquired of the clerk whether the orchestral score of the Brahms symphony had arrived, and when he answered in the affirmative, she asked whether it was for sale. "Certainly," answered the clerk. She thereupon purchased a copy of the score and sent it up to my father with her compliments. His astonishment was intense, but she did not tell him until weeks afterward how she had obtained it. He received the score on a Thursday, and the first rehearsal for the next concert was to take place on the following Monday. This left but little time to obtain the necessary orchestral parts, and Schirmer naturally would not sell him any. He therefore cut the score into 3 parts and divided them among 3 copyists who worked day and night and managed to have the parts ready in time for the rehearsal. Great was the triumph in the Damrosch camp at this victory over the Thomas forces. Some years later I gave the first performances in New York of the 3rd and 4th Brahms symphonies, but I had no need to resort to stratagem to obtain the scores and orchestral parts. Orchestral conditions were bad compared with today. There was no such thing as a permanent orchestra. The musicians of the Symphony Society, for instance, played in 6 symphony concerts during the winter, each preceded by a public rehearsal. They also officiated at 4 concerts of the Oratorio Society, and this was almost the extent of their efforts in that direction. The rest of the time, they made their living by teaching, playing in theaters, at dances, and some of them even at political or military processions and mass meetings. If a better job came along than the symphony concert, they would simply send my father a substitute. Small wonder that occasionally their lips gave out and the first horn or trumpet would break on an important note during a symphony concert. And yet, in spite of this disheartening condition, my father succeeded in infusing the orchestral players with such emotional intensity and imparting so lofty an interpretation to them that the audiences of that day were often roused to the greatest enthusiasm, and I would tuck my arm very proudly into his as we marched home from a concert, even though we knew that the subscription to the concert was not more than $800, and the single sale at the box office had not reached the $100 mark. But all this was changed like a flash in the year 1879, when my father decided to perform The Damnation of Faust by Berlioz, until then unknown in America. This concert, which was held at Steinway Hall in East 14th Street, necessitated the services of solo singers, the New York Symphony Orchestra, the chorus of the New York Oratorio Society, and the male chorus of the Orion Society. The work and the performance made a sensation. All New York buzzed with it, and during that winter, 1879, it was given 5 times in succession to crowded houses, creating an excitement such as New York had never before seen in the concert field. I played in all these performances at the last stand of the second violins, as my father considered it of the utmost value to me as a future conductor to be able to follow the conductor's beat as one of the orchestra. End of section 3.